standard as time goes by.
Preaching to the gangs of Southwest Houston later today on Eyewitness News.
From ABC News. This Week with David Brinkley. Now from Washington, David Brinkley.
Richard Nixon. His friends rally around him in death as they did in life. His enemies hesitate to say too much, but they do admit now that after he was forced out of the presidency, he spent the next 20 years being helpful and useful to the presidents who came after him. He did have his ups and downs. His ups were high, and his downs were the lowest. The country survived the shock of his resignation and went on. We'll hear today from some who knew him. And on a turbulent weekend, the Serbs in Bosnia were given a deadline: stop the butchery or face more and bigger attacks by NATO's air power. We'll try to deal with all of that with today's guests. Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democrat, New York, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's Secretary of State. And former Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, who was a key member of the Senate Watergate Committee. Two background reports, one from Tony Bertley in Sarajevo and one from our man Jack Smith in Washington. And a discussion here with George Will, Sam Donaldson, and Cokie Roberts, all here on our Sunday program. First, a little news since the Sunday morning papers. In Johannesburg this morning, a very heavy car bomb exploded near the headquarters of the African National Congress. It killed 7 or more and wounded more than 70 others. The country's first multiracial election is only 2 days away. Richard Nixon will be buried Wednesday in California. President Clinton and all living ex-presidents will attend: Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush. President Clinton has declared Wednesday to be a national day of mourning. UN troops are in Gorazde, planning to move out about 600 patients in need of medical care. With UN troops in the city, it seemed unlikely the threat of airstrikes would be carried out. Now, ABC's Tony Bertley, standing by in Sarajevo, will bring us up to date. Tony?
A UN convoy left Sarajevo today, bound for the Muslim enclave of Gorazde. It's taking 200 UN peacekeepers to help maintain a ceasefire. The UN says the Serbs have stopped shelling the town, although there are reports of machine gun and sniper fire in the center. The Serbs are so far not withdrawing their forces, which is in defiance of the NATO ultimatum. Even so, the UN has ruled out the possibility of airstrikes because UN troops who arrived in the town last night would be at risk. Meanwhile, doctors were standing by in Sarajevo to receive wounded from the town, but UN helicopters were held up for nearly 2 hours by the Serbs. It seems as if the UN is doing everything it can to avoid calling airstrikes, even though the Serbs continue to defy the NATO ultimatum. David?
Tony, exactly what is Gorazde? Is it a big city, a country town, or what? What is it?
It's a small industrial town. Before the war, it had a population in that area of about 38,000. But its importance to the Serbs is it's one of the obstacles on the way to giving them access to the sea. And that, people here say, is their ultimate goal.
Tony, what do you think is going to happen there?
I think the Serbs have realized that NATO and the Western Alliance is very serious in its intentions with Gorazde, and they've pulled back, and I think they will pull back, but they've been playing a game of brinkmanship and testing the resolve of NATO and the UN, which has been shown to be wanting at stages.
Tony, thank you very much. Good luck to you. We'll be back with Secretary of State Warren Christopher in a moment.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life. And by ADM, supermarket to the world.
In 1862, the average American farmer fed 5 people for 1 year. Today, he feeds more than 90, not just Americans, but people around the world as well. Obviously, as a leading processor of food ingredients, we at the Archer Daniels Midland Company couldn't survive without the American farmer. But then, neither could you.
experience the true joy of cooking, it must be pursued with reckless abandon and total disregard for the inevitable splatters, spills, squirts, and the occasional splash. Fortunately, GE's profile cooking appliances have ingenious quick clean features like lift-top ranges, self-cleaning ovens, easy wipe surfaces, and sealed burners. So they clean with just a wipe. GE's profile appliances are so easy to clean, they take the joy of cooking to new heights.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for coming in today.
Good morning,
Pleased
David.
to have you with us.
Thank you.
George Will is here with us, and Sam Donaldson. Now, I believe you've had a briefing rather recently. Bring us up to date, if you will, on what's happening in Bosnia.
David, the ultimatum put into effect by NATO seems to be working. We're monitoring the situation very carefully, of course, but at the present time it appears to be working. I've talked several times this morning with General Shalikashvili, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had reports from Bosnia as well. These are the elements right now. First, there's been no shelling in the city today, although there has been some small arms fire. Second, there are about 140 United Nations troops in the city now. Those are Ukrainians and Northern Europeans. There are about 500 more on their way. These are United Kingdom troops, Egyptians and Russians, and our estimate is they'll arrive about 2 o'clock today. There are evacuations going forward now. British and French helicopters are evacuating wounded. They hope to have out between 200 and 300 during the course of the day. It appears that the Serbs are withdrawing to this 2-mile radius. The withdrawal was somewhat spotty, but my latest reports from the scene is that the withdrawal is taking place. Now, those are all good signs, but we'll be monitoring it very carefully. We've been disappointed before, but so far today, it's encouraging.
Is it too much to say that we may now be on the way towards some kind of settlement?
Well, we'll certainly be turning to that. I'll be going to Europe tonight, and I'll be meeting tomorrow in London with the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, Foreign Secretary Hurd, and then we'll be joined by the Foreign Minister of France, Alain Juppé. And on Tuesday, I'll be meeting in Geneva with Andrei Kosarev of Russia, so we can start to focus on the other track. But the NATO ultimatum remains in effect. It's a NATO decision, and there will be action taken if there are violations. As you know, last night, the United Nations confirmed the fact that if there was violations of the ultimatum and NATO asked for airstrikes, the United Nations would go along. I had several talks yesterday, a couple of talks yesterday with Secretary General Boutros-Ghali, and his statement last night, I think, was the result of conversations we'd had during the course of the day.
These meetings you're about to have, are they all about Bosnia and how to deal with it?
Well, it would be primarily focused on Bosnia, and there are other senior-level meetings in Europe next week of our diplomats. We have to focus on both of these tracks at the same time. We need to make sure that NATO power is recognized. At the same time, the ultimate solution to this problem, of course, has to come at the negotiating table. It won't be settled on the battlefield, and so I think we're now ought to concentrate on both tracks.
Air power alone, however, has never won a war nor imposed a peace. You have Serbia bent clearly on creating Greater Serbia. What makes you think that the mere threat of air power is going to stop this fundamental animus they have?
Well, George, I think we had a good deal of momentum toward peace. As you know, there were negotiations in Geneva that were rather close to conclusion. The parties had agreed on a numerical division between the various enclaves or sectors of the country. We were able, through our diplomacy, to put together a relationship, a federation between the Croats and the Muslims. I think that was an important step forward. The situation in Sarajevo was quite promising. Certainly we were interrupted this momentum by the tragic situation in Gorazde, but if we can arrest that situation there and regain the momentum, I think there's a chance for a negotiated peace. It certainly there's some difficult negotiations ahead, but I think it can be done.
Some people believe that you might encourage the negotiating impulses of the Serbs if the arms embargo were lifted. And they say the following three things. It has been inherently one-sided because Serbia had the arms of the old Yugoslav army and had a munitions industry. And it is illegal. First of all, it interferes with Bosnia, the nation's right of self-defense recognized in the UN Charter. And that it was imposed before Yugoslavia dissolved and before Bosnia was admitted to the UN. So why in the world can't we do it quickly and unilaterally, and why shouldn't we?
Well, there are several answers to that question, George. First, to just correct a factual mistake, I think the embargo was imposed on Bosnia after it became a state. There was an explicit UN resolution applying the arms embargo to Bosnia. So there is, in effect, a UN resolution.
But that was extending an embargo already in effect.
Yes, but there was a resolution specifically to that effect. But beyond that, I think the time now is to focus on the NATO action, the NATO decision, and the negotiating track. The arms embargo, which we've long wanted to lift, I think is something that needs to be considered for the future and kept in reserve. But if the United States were to lift it unilaterally now, which is, I gather, your suggestion, yes, it would do two rather adverse things. First, I think it would give the United States a responsibility for this conflict. It would thrust us into the middle of the situation, because if you lift the arms embargo, you probably take on a responsibility for supplying the arms. You certainly take on a responsibility, a very heavy one. Beyond that, I think if you say that you can lift this arms embargo, that means that the United States and other nations can decide which of the UN resolutions they'll comply with. It would mean other nations could say, we won't comply with the resolution on Iraq. They might say, we won't comply with a resolution on Haiti, or indeed we won't comply with a resolution with respect to Serbia. That's a very dangerous course to go down.
Is it a dangerous course, though, for the United States to say, we are not just another chair occupant in the UN, we're different? Aren't we different?
Well, with respect to this particular problem, I think we need to act with other nations. This problem is in the center of Europe. I think it's desirable for us to have the help of other nations, to share the burden with other nations in Europe. If we take it on alone, it's a mighty large problem. It can only be solved with hundreds of thousands of troops. It's a very large commitment, and I think the United States is on the right course, a steady course toward trying to make sure we can have a negotiation that will finally solve this problem.
Mr. Secretary, do I understand correctly that the ultimatum required the Serbs to withdraw some 3 kilometers from Gorazde by 8:01 Washington time last night, but that they have not yet fully withdrawn?
Well, they're in the process of withdrawing. There were 3 parts of the NATO ultimatum. First, that there be no shelling, and there have been no shelling today. Second, that they allow humanitarian relief and allow the UNPROFOR troops to come in. And third, that there be a withdrawal. The withdrawal has begun. One of the purposes, Sam, of having the the United Nations forces go in is to interpose them between the Serbs and the Muslims. The withdrawal, as I say this morning, our reports are that they seem to be taking place. If that withdrawal takes place, then I think it's very significant.
Secretary, what's the purpose of having an ultimatum saying if by this time you haven't done that, we're going to strike you from the air, and not doing it?
Sam, the fact is that virtually all of the ultimatum has been complied with. They're trying to comply with it. I don't want to try to get into explaining the Serbs' position, but what they're saying is that we need to have the United Nations forces between us and the Muslims, because as we try to withdraw, they're firing on us. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think it's prudent, Sam, to give them an opportunity to complete the withdrawal if, as is our present reports, they are trying to withdraw.
Well, it may be prudent, Mr. Secretary, but doesn't it send the wrong signal, which is, hey, guys, you can do really what you want on your own timetable without regard to what we tell you?
We don't intend to let them do that, but it seems to me that they're trying to be in compliance at the present time.
All right, let me ask you about a quotation from Richard Nixon in his last book, which has not yet been published, but will be shortly. He says this: had the citizens of Sarajevo been predominantly Christian or Jewish, the civilized world would not have permitted the siege to reach the point it did. Do you agree with that?
No, I really don't. It seems to me that our policy there was not related to what kind of individuals were involved. You know, that's a very, very complicated situation in Bosnia. Your next guest, Senator Moynihan, has written really a brilliant monograph on the problems of ethnic controversies and geographical controversies, and I think we have to recognize the complexities of the situation. I think we found a way to deal with the Sarajevo situation that seems to be working, but I must say I think the NATO decision with respect to Sarajevo was based upon our concern for the citizens there, the tragic situation. But in Sarajevo, there are maybe 2/3 Muslim and 1/3 Serbs.
Let me just, I know we have very little time, but I have to ask you about North Korea, which still is refusing to allow the inspection that the international agency wants of its facility. What is our policy going to be?
Well, our policy is as it was before. We're insisting on the inspections. We're also wanting to have a dialogue between North and South Korea, so there is a nuclear-free peninsula there.
But, sir, if they don't allow the inspection, you say we're insisting on them. What are we going to do about it?
Well, we'll have to go back to the United Nations and seek other action. But there was some relatively encouraging news this week. As you know, they're about to unload the nuclear fuel rods from a reactor there, and they've indicated that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, could come in and observe that unloading to try to ensure that there was not some reprocessing of the fuel rods as they're removed.
You believe they'll do that?
Well, they indicate they're doing that. Now, they'll be talking to the agency about that particular thing now, but that's an encouraging step. Sam, we have to be persistent here, but we have to follow our policy with steadiness and not lurch in this situation. That's a dangerous situation, but I think we ought to try to resolve it if we possibly can through diplomacy. One thing we know right now, at least we feel right now, that as the safeguards are in effect, the situation is not worsening there. So I think the countries in the region, Japan, South Korea, or Republic of Korea, and China are very anxious for us to proceed carefully, diplomatically, and that's what we're doing.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. Thanks very much for coming in. We wish you luck.
Thank you very much.
Coming next, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democrat, New York, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and will be with us in a moment.
To you, this may be just a bushel of corn. But to us at the Archer Daniels Midland Company, it's enough pure golden corn oil to make 2 pounds of margarine. It's also enough protein meal to raise 3 chickens. We even capture the surplus heat generated during processing and use it to accelerate the hydroponic growth of fresh vegetables. From what's left, we distill 2.5 gallons of ethanol, used to make cleaner-burning, high-octane gasoline to help improve the environment. So you see, we get both food and fuel from each bushel of corn. One more reason why ADM is known as Supermarket to the World.
There's a lot more going on at your local Kinko's these days than just making coffee.
Happy birthday! Make a wish!
Now Sprint is bringing the world's largest video conferencing network to Kinko's all across America.
I think you'll like it.
So now, even people thousands of miles apart can be there in the very same room. Only this room comes with a mute button.
A new chapter has begun in Merrill Lynch's history in Asia. We are the first American securities firm invited to open an office in mainland China. Being there gives our financial consultants a different perspective, which makes a difference for our clients. The difference is Merrill Lynch.
Monday, get this. To fill your prescriptions, some pharmacists are mixing their own drugs.
What can you make?
Anything you want. What's your need?
Pharmacists say they can be trusted, but mistakes could be dangerous, even deadly. If you ever get a prescription filled, don't miss Day One with Forrest Sawyer, Monday.
Senator Moynihan, thanks for coming.
Good morning.
Pleased to have you. Good morning. You know everybody here, George, Sam, all of us. Now, do you want to lift the embargo on weapons going to the Bosnians so they can defend themselves?
Absolutely, unilaterally, and immediately.
Well, that seems to be a fairly thorough answer. How do you get them in? How do you get weapons in? They're surrounded by enemies, almost.
There's things called parachutes.
Mm-hmm.
There are things called, there's an airfield. That airfield is, I've flown in there under a lot more fire than they would be taking today. May I make a point here?
Please do. We want you to make all the points you like.
United Nations Security Council is said to be seized of this issue, and we can't do it until they lift the embargo. That is not so. This was specifically contemplated as a problem when the charter was drafted at Dumbarton Oaks, about 15 blocks from here. And that is why Article 51 says nothing in this charter shall interfere with the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. Now, I've served as president of the Security Council, and I can tell you exactly how we would have ruled. There would have been a vote, but if Bosnia and the United States decide that the rights of self-defense is being violated, constricted by this embargo, we have a right to go to their help.
Only we have a right to do it. Should we do it?
Yes. And
why is it our duty to do that?
Well, maybe I should calm down here.
No,
please.
It's just great the way you are.
We are shredding. We're in the process of shredding the entire legal order that we put in place at the end of World War II. You asked Secretary Christopher, for whom we all have deep regard and respect. In his trip to Europe, he's going to be focusing on Bosnia. And he said, yes, we'll be focusing on Bosnia. He should be focusing on Serbia. Serbia has invaded another country, a member of the United Nations, in violation of the Charter. Then they have specifically associated themselves with genocide, in violation of the Genocide Treaty, of which we are a member, and it is our law, and in Gorazd, the Fourth Geneva Convention on the treatment of civilians during wartime. I mean, all those are fundamentals, and we're letting them drift away.
Should we go to war?
One more question before I let Sam and George in. Are you in favor of attacking Belgrade, bombing it or otherwise? That's the capital of Serbia.
I would not have a bridge left on the Danube between the in Yugoslavia. Not one bridge. I would close every airport. I wouldn't bomb the city. We're not interested in that.
But American military force seems to be tangled up with a Japanese diplomat and an Egyptian civil servant and a British general and a president of the United States who seems to be well down in the chain here.
You got a pretty good general there. But for the rest, the United Nations cannot impose a peace. It can monitor one that has been established.
Sir, in a book you published a few years ago called On the Law of Nations by Patrick Moynihan, I want to read a few things. 2 weeks before the 1944 election, Roosevelt said, "The Council of the United Nations must have the power to act quickly and decisively to keep the peace by force if necessary." And pursuant to that, in 1945, we passed, and it is the law of the land, the United Nations Participation Act of 1945, in which it is said, "The President shall not be deemed to require the authorization of the Congress to make available to the Security Council on its call the armed forces, facilities, and assistance provided for therein." Now, however, there were supposed to be, the President is authorized to negotiate a special agreement or agreements with the Security Council which shall be subject to the approval of Congress. Are you satisfied, even under the terms of that Act of 1945, that Congress and the elected representatives of the American people are sufficiently involved in the disposition of American military force in the Balkans?
We would know, because what that act contemplated, and we would never pass it today, is that we were going to make available, as would other countries, forces to the UN. We give them the 82nd Airborne, whatever. Having done that, and Congress having agreed, the President thereafter could agree to their deployment anywhere for any purposes that he and the UN Security Council had in mind. There would be a world army. Well, there wasn't, and there won't be. Whatever has to be done, the Congress has to be involved. We're not right now. We're on the edge of passing a resolution saying the president shall lift that embargo. And again, I want to state, because it is a question of law, it's not near necessarily understood, we have the right, under Article 51 of the Charter, the inherent right to do this.
Well, you were agitated at first. I tried to break in with a question. Let me renew it. Should we go to war? Should the United States participate in more than just bombing through NATO and the UN to stop the Serbs?
We should give the Bosnians the chance to defend themselves against aggression by a neighboring country. Aggression which, you know, Andrei Kosyrev, the Russian foreign minister, called it criminal yesterday.
Well,
it's criminal. It's genocide. It's a violation of every elemental treaty.
With all due respect, even I understand your position about lifting the embargo. I've asked you whether the United States should actively go to war.
I don't think we have to.
All right. May I now change the subject? Our time is short. To health reform, health care reform.
Must you?
I'd like to.
This is the world order.
This is the world order.
Rostkowski's taxes.
But I now read in the newspaper that perhaps key people like you, and you are one of the key people to this, tax health care benefits as a way to raise revenue to make it work. Are you for that?
The President's bill contemplates that 10 years out we will begin to tax benefits that are above a median price plan. So that's on the table.
But I mean now.
Well, 10 years from now, or now we're talking, we're negotiating a time, aren't we?
Well,
the principle has been pretty well understood.
Rostkowski says perhaps you need to raise taxes now to finance a universal program.
He's talking about additional taxes against taxing benefits as if they were income.
Yeah, but it's money. Where would you like to get the money?
We're going to have to get it somewhere because we don't have any now.
Well, would you like to advance this 10-year timetable closer to...
We're negotiating. The Finance Committee is meeting regularly now. We're behind, you know, we're trying to see what we can agree on. We've agreed on universal health care coverage as a principle. Having got there, I think it'll give us a few weeks to get step by step. The President asked us this week, asked me, if we could get a bill out by Memorial Day. We'll try.
George, you have a few seconds left.
Yes, recurring to the world order and the shredding of international customs and laws and mores. Early on in this crisis, before ethnic cleansing really had got started, before the shelling of hospitals and all the rest, there was talk by the United States government of war crimes and war crimes trials.
Sir.
Should there be, and how do you bring that off?
The International Court of Justice in The Hague has put the Republic of Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro on notice that war crimes have been committed, and there should be war criminal trials, or we will have law. What did we fight the Second World War for? What did 50 years of war and Cold War end up at? The same nihilism that brought us...
But how do you physically get the criminals in the dock?
That's the next question.
I just asked it.
Go in and get them.
We can't even enforce an ultimatum, Senator.
Sam, go ahead.
I was just asking you, do you believe the ultimatum that the UN set down last night and...
We're going to get those two Libyans who blew up that Pan Am 103, and we know the names, and we have the photographs of the people involved in rape, in murder, in monstrous behavior. We know their names, and we can get them. The world is going to live a long time. We have long memories and strong institutions. If we don't do it...
You're going to get the Libyans.
You're damn right we are.
103. What about the ultimatum that expired in Grozny? Should it have been enforced with airstrikes?
Yes.
It wasn't.
That's because we're going through a UN command, which George Will describes, is unworkable for purposes of a military operation.
Senator Moynihan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Pleasure, as always, to have you with us. We love having you. Coming shortly, Jack Smith with his background report on Richard Nixon, and then two Washington figures who worked closely with him, Henry Kissinger and Senator Howard Baker. In a moment.
Alex Garcia enjoys his job, but after work is when he really gets his kick. At ITT, we encourage all our employees to find ways to support their communities.
All right, much better.
Through athletics, through education, by giving something back to the kids who are our future. In the case of Alex, it's a ball. ITT, we're adding more than just our name.
Buy hamburger, cook it up, and you'll discover you have a whole lot of something you don't even want. Try Harvest Burgers from who else? Green Giant. And get the flavor without all the fat. They're all vegetable, with far less fat than hamburger, no cholesterol, and lots of taste. New Harvest Burgers from Green Giant. Everything you want from a burger, without everything you don't.
This Week with David Brinkley will continue in a moment. After this, from our ABC station.
Next time on Good Morning America, remembering President Richard Nixon.
We'll look back at the life and the legacy of our 37th president.
On Good Morning America next time here on ABC.
559, 725, we done it 750. Sold them.
Hello, I'm Mark Thomas. We're conducting an auction Wednesday through Sunday, April 28th through May 1st. Assets include office furniture and equipment, including more than 300 computers from the closing of the FDIC Houston offices and others. Also traditional desks, conference tables, executive leather chairs, residential furniture, including fine leather sofas and chairs, 18th century dining room and bedroom suites, quality jewelry, handmade Persian rugs, automobiles such as Mercedes and Jaguar. Call 682-0475 or see today's Chronicle.
Which Cadillac dealer has sensational low prices?
Peacock's the place.
Which Cadillac dealer gives you top dollar for your trade-in?
Peacock's the place.
With the best deals in town, who do you suppose has free loan cards and one of Cadillac's best customer satisfaction ratings in America? Right again. Tom Peacock Cadillac, I-45 North at Airtex.
Keeping up with the disabled, the story, Monday morning on Eyewitness News at 6.
Jack Smith, what did Richard Nixon leave behind? What was his legacy? Here's Jack Smith. Jack?
David, it's testimony to his legacy that were Nixon president today, those who knew him say that in the Balkans, the trouble spot that occupies policymakers nowadays, he'd have done things very differently.
President Nixon would have tried to have found some way to resolve it before it sort of got out of hand.
He was the most effective foreign policy president since World War II, and perhaps even before that.
Nixon had domestic achievements for sure, and he was no Republican ideologue. He took the U.S. off the gold standard, and he created the Environmental Protection Agency. But it was in foreign policy that he left his mark. Nixon got the U.S. out of Vietnam. It wasn't fast enough for many Americans, and so he was reviled, especially by the young. Then, with Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, and later his Secretary of State, Nixon set about reshaping the world.
The Chinese people are a great people.
His opening to China split the communist world in two. And by negotiating the first arms control treaty with Moscow, he showed that the two superpowers could coexist.
There's a lot in between, of course. But I think basically that Nixon and Kissinger created a new structure of international relations that led to the end of the Cold War.
It was Nixon's vindictive streak, though, that turned a third-rate burglary at the Watergate apartments into a cover-up and a subsequent inquiry that wrecked his administration.
But I'm trying to focus on the president. What did the president know, and when did he know it?
It's how he'll always be remembered.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body.
The only president to resign from office. While he later sought the mantle of elder statesman by his many visits with world leaders, the legacy of Watergate became distrust of government and a scrutiny of the presidency that some think today has gone too far. Richard Nixon was an enigma, a Quaker who hated his enemies, a peacemaker blamed for prolonging war, and a shy man who always wanted to be a politician. And were it not for Watergate, probably remembered as a good and sometimes even great president. David?
Jack, thank you. Now we have two guests who were in Washington in positions of responsibility during some or all of Nixon's presidency. Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor and then his Secretary of State, and Howard Baker, former Republican senator from Tennessee, and a member of the Watergate Investigating Committee. We thank you both for coming in. Happy to have you with us. Mr. Kissinger, first, you worked for President Nixon closely for quite some time. Tell us your thoughts today after his death.
President Nixon in the field of foreign policy will go down as one of the seminal American presidents. Not only because of the specific initiatives that he guided or invented, but above all because he tried to relate the various elements of American foreign policy to some overriding theme, because he had a long-range objective and because he was willing to go to it in a solitary manner, bringing his people along with him step by step. I think the major breakthroughs in foreign policy, in one way or the other, owe a great deal to his presidency.
Senator Baker, give us your thought, will you?
Well, my principal thought in retrospect is that the whole Watergate episode was a great waste. You know, I'm convinced that Richard Nixon didn't know a thing on earth about that burglary before it happened. And he had one key and fatal error that brought down his presidency, and that was as soon as he found out about it, he tried to contain it instead of trying to liquidate it. And the great waste is we lost his talents, we lost, I think, a successful and potentially a very great presidency, certainly in terms of foreign policy. And we also brought this country to a place where there's an inherent cynicism that will take a long time to dissipate.
Senator Baker, you're saying really that Watergate was a mere episode that rose rather like a bolt of lightning somehow. Others would say that it occurred because of a climate of extreme hostility and suspicion and cynicism that Mr. Nixon radiated. And my question is this: knowing what you now know about Mr. Nixon and his ill at ease with the fundamentals of politics and his hostility towards so much of American life, should he have been president? Maybe he was a good man in the wrong career.
No, I think he was the right man at the right time, George. I think he had a carefully thought out, rational foreign policy that was unique at that time in our history and led really to the ending of the Cold War. I think that's a historic contribution, and I think it would have been a great loss to this country and to the world had he not been president. And I think on the domestic scene, you know, I was one of the authors of the revenue sharing bill, and I still think that his embrace of that was an evidence of his perspective and his understanding of the system. No president is ever perfect, and I doubt that we've ever had a president who wasn't mad at his enemies one time or the other, and I've witnessed some of that firsthand. But I think on balance it would have been a great shame had he not had the opportunity to lead us, and it is a great shame that we lost him to Watergate.
Mr. Kissinger, what do you say to those, I'll say those of us who say, that the effect of his and your détente policy was really to prolong the life of the Soviet Union, not to hasten its end, and that indeed much of the Nixon administration was devoted to making almost a fetish of arms control, which was bound to be, as some of us think it turned out to be, impossible until it became unimportant?
But I would say that not even George Will can be right 100% of the time.
But am I right here?
No, you are wrong here. You have to understand what the situation was when Richard Nixon came into office. We had to liquidate a war in Vietnam. We were facing a Soviet Union that was engaged in a massive buildup. We faced what looked like a communist monolith with a badly divided country and a Soviet Union that had not yet lost its self-confidence. I don't understand in what way what Nixon did prolonged, and what I did, prolonged the life of the Soviet Union. We divided the communist bloc. We demonstrated that the communist world was not a monolith. We then began to play these two against each other. We gradually weakened their self-confidence. We established in the European Security Conference the so-called Basket III, which was one of the contributing factors to the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. And I believe history will show that the Cold War began to be won starting in the Nixon administration.
Dr. Kissinger, respond to the criticism that President Nixon was not a man of principle when it came to any of the things that he did, but he simply was a man who used the situation ethics of the moment. He could be an anti-communist, and then he could open to China, which offended people like George Will. He could prosecute the war in Vietnam and then go into Cambodia in a secret incursion. Was he a man of no principle?
Well, first of all, the incursions were in secret. There were plenty of demonstrations against him. Richard Nixon in foreign policy was a man of principle. His objectives were clear. He believed in America. He was, in fact, a Wilsonian in his basic beliefs in foreign policy. He was tactically extremely flexible based on his analysis of the realities of the situation. He had to liquidate the war in Vietnam. And unlike the protesters, he had 550,000 troops on the ground, and he wanted to extricate them without either a military debacle or without undermining the credibility of the United States towards the tens of millions who had relied on our word. He found a communist world in which he noticed a split, a possibility of a split, and he thought that dealing with China was a way of weakening communism as a world power, and he turned out to be correct. He never stopped being an anti-communist, but he realized that in order to go from here to there, he had to understand the world as it was and not simply make abstract proclamations.
Senator Baker, in listening to you discuss President Nixon just a moment ago, I almost forget that there was a Watergate and that you were on a key committee which helped bring the president down, because you acted as if it was almost a trivial event. Was it not a major event, and did it not expose a major flaw in this man, not just some minor imperfection?
Sam, I never meant to imply that it was minor. It was cataclysmic. What I did say, and what I repeat, is that it's a great shame and a great waste that we had to lose him, because I think he was a good president. But, you know, the toughest thing I ever did in my political career was to realize, as I did soon after the committee was formed, that there was more to this than I had thought. Originally, I thought it was a Democratic dirty trick to embarrass Nixon in the '72 campaign. But I remember visiting with Nixon in his private office in the EOB, and when I left there, I had the jolting realization that I had a very difficult task ahead of me. I had helped nominate Nixon. He'd campaigned for me, and if I was going to follow the facts wherever they led me, which indeed I tried to do, that it might lead me directly into the Oval Office. But I think the committee did its job. I think the country understands that. But even so, and it was a cataclysmic event, but even so, I think, in retrospect, it was a shame that it had to lead to the cynicism and the loss.
Well, Senator, it was a cataclysmic event, but did he not bring it on himself? He was not a bystander to the dam broke and the flood sort of swept him away. What was in his character? What was in the character of this man that led him to do what he did?
Certainly it was in his character, and certainly it was a mistake, and a pivotal mistake, a fatal mistake that he made, and when he decided to try to contain it instead of liquidate it. But the real triggering episode that brought about the fall of Richard Nixon was that decision to try to contain the thing instead of going to the American people and saying, you wouldn't believe what some of these clowns have done, and firing them, maybe on television. But he didn't make that decision, and it brought him down.
George, one last question.
Senator, I gather you believe that Watergate had as one of its lasting consequences a bad effect on the civility of the press. Indeed, the press seems to believe, some of them, I guess now, that civility is not part of or compatible with journalism. Can you say what you think about that?
Oh, I think that's a problem, George, but I think it's a problem in public service and government, too. I think a lack of civility is the major contributor to the so-called gridlock and difficulties we have in Congress. I think that history will yet determine whether or not the enhanced or increased cynicism that the press and the public have turned out to be a good thing or whether it's a bad thing. I think on balance it has been corrosive and destructive to a degree, but I think in the future it may produce a better system.
Senator Baker and Secretary Kissinger, thank you both very much for coming in and talking with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you. Coming next, our rambling little discussion here, and joining us will be Cokie Roberts of ABC News in a moment.
At first, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem. A tire here, a tire there. But it all adds up to the point where Americans dispose of more than 250 million tires a year. But at the Archer Daniels Midland Company, we're doing something about it. We're taking tires that would ordinarily be an environmental problem. We're shredding them and mixing them with coal to create a fuel that burns cleaner in our power plant, providing the energy we need to produce ethanol, a gasoline additive derived from surplus cornstarch that helps reduce carbon monoxide emissions by up to 25%. So as you can see, by using a little ingenuity, we at ADM have got yet another good idea rolling. ADM, supermarket to the world.
Is it going to be scary?
There was a time when you had to prepare a child for exploratory surgery.
Will you stay there with me?
Calm his fears, soothe his anxieties.
Mom, I want to go home.
Yeah. Comfort him when he imagined the worst.
Can I bring Sam?
Sure. Well, today it's a lot easier and less expensive because the exploratory can be performed without a scalpel, without anesthesia, even without a hospital stay, if it's performed by GE's magnetic resonance imager, a remarkably simple way to give doctors a clear picture of problems that could only be diagnosed before with costly surgery. It's not serious, he'll be fine.
Ready to go home?
The MR imager from GE, it makes looking inside the human body easier for everyone.
Hey, Sam, that wasn't so bad.
GE, we bring good things to life.
Sunday, they prayed for a miracle. They got Clint Eastwood.
Have you seen him before?
Yep, he's our new preacher. An avenging angel against all odds.
Nothing like a nice piece of hickory.
Sunday at 8:30, 7:30 Central, here on ABC. Clint Eastwood, Pale Rider.
You've heard a great deal about Nixon. What do you think about it?
Well, it's so remarkable to think of a world without him. My entire life, Richard Nixon has been a dominant political force and sort of there at every important moment in my life. But and what I sort of look back on now is how he affected our politics so incredibly over the last 50 years, starting with understanding when he got here, part of that group of young Republicans that really made anti-communism an incredible theme in the Republican Party. And then, but always a bipartisan foreign policy player from the very beginning when he was on the Herter Commission and worked for the Marshall Plan. And then moving on through the Southern strategy and bringing taking the solid South away from the Democrats in that time. And then with Watergate, the effect on the Republican Party of having them become a shrinking party, a more conservative party, and the Democrats not being able to understand their incredible stupidity in 1972 because they won so wildly after Watergate that it took them until now to get back to the kind of centrist president that Richard Nixon really was.
It's interesting, you know, you can take anything, he had such a long, varied public life, and maximize it and say he was great in foreign policy, he was this, that, the other, but I have to tell you where I come out on Richard Nixon. And that is that he stooped to the kind of low, dirty tricks to gain his objectives in life that I think are impermissible.
Let me interrupt a second. You're talking about Helen Gahagan Douglas?
I'm talking about Jerry Voorhees in 1946, Helen Gahagan Douglas in 1950, Earl Warren in 1952. I'm talking about Pat Brown in 62, but it didn't work then. I'm talking about Watergate. And I think there are some standards. To say that he was wonderful on foreign policy, I would agree in many respects. But to get there, he did things which I think are not permissible in American life or ought not to be. And they're certainly not instructive to, we always talk about our children and our grandchildren as the way you win in this world. If that's the way you win in this world, we send the wrong lesson.
Well,
George?
in fact,
let me speak to policy. Frankly, I thought his domestic policies were unfortunate and his foreign policy was worse, but let me talk about this. On domestic policy, if you define liberalism in the simple but serviceable way of saying the liberal program is strengthening the central government as society's supervisor, then with the exception of Johnson's administration, Nixon's was the most liberal administration since the Second World War. OSHA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Racial quotas started. Wage and price controls, the largest single intrusion of government into American life.
Pat Moynihan, who was one of his domestic
clean
advisors.
air. Food
The
stamps.
SST, John Conley, I mean, all the rest. And abortion was essentially legalized while Nixon was in there, the opinion written by a Nixon judge. I mean, his effect on domestic policy was
You've never forgiven him for the Shanghai Communique, George.
I come to foreign policy.
Ah.
I made my friend, Mr. Kissinger, a little cross a moment ago by my question, and let me elaborate it. He just gave a very, I thought, an extremely good defense of what I take to be the barely defensible, but what Ronald Reagan did, and the importance of Reagan is Reagan remoralized American policy. He said, détente is really not acceptable. The Reagan rhetoric, focus of evil in the modern world, the evil empire, was a specific attempt to re-energize America, its energy having been sapped by détente.
Well, I asked Mr. Kissinger if President Nixon had any standards, and I wasn't talking now about the ethical standards about which my discussion just a moment ago dealt. I think he was a pragmatist. The end justified the means. I don't believe the end justifies the means, therefore I thought that was wrong. And Dr. Kissinger says the incursion to Cambodia was open. Yes, it was open after a while, but not originally. Not the bombing and not the original incursions.
I think that the point that Senator Baker made about a lack of civility in our public life is really, a lot of it was started by that group of young Republicans who came in 1946, the Richard Nixon's, Joseph McCarthy's, who came and were uncivil. Now, there was something to that. It turned Washington on its head. They might have had a lot of validity on their side, but there was nothing civil about it. And then when you got to Vietnam and Watergate, the lack of trust that has created forevermore against the government, both on the part of the press and on the part of the American people, I think makes it very hard to get back to a degree of civility.
Michael Barone and others, Barone, wonderful analyst of American politics, says, and I think rightly, that Nixon arrived at the presidency just at a moment when cultural questions of values, were beginning to energize our politics, not old economic redistribution questions. And Stephen Ambrose, very good biographer of Richard Nixon, says, and he may be right about this, he says, the cultural politics began with Nixon's so-called farewell press conference in 1962, when he rounded on the press and said, there are two Americas here. There's the cultural values reflected in the elite institutions of the press and academia and elsewhere, and there's the rest of us. And Ambrose may be right, that was the real moment when politics began to change.
One of Nixon's accomplishments, I suppose, was the modern use of television or misuse of television by politicians. In 1968, he ran for the presidency very effectively with a series of ads in which he was seen to be standing there answering questions, the audience thought, from ordinary Americans. He sort of was the precursor of Phil Donahue, or Bill Clinton, if you will. These were not ordinary Americans. These were people who had been hired to put there.
Well, go back to 1952. The Chequers speech was seen by 60 million Americans, the first time anything in national politics had gotten to that many American homes ever. And that was the first example of going over the heads of the press and of the party leaders to the American people.
Well, he did that effectively. And going over Dwight Eisenhower's head, it is said that General Eisenhower broke a pencil when he heard Mr. Nixon say, write to the Republican National Committee if you support me, not to Ike.
But you know, George's point about the culture, what's interesting about it is if it had not been for the Vietnam War, I think that you would not have had the parties go off in such different directions there. But what happened was the Democrats became the anti-war party, and the anti-war faction were the people who were demonstrating and who seemed to be the cultural elite and all of that. And it was, and old Democrats looked at those long-haired kids who were using dirty words and demonstrating against our boys in Vietnam, and they did not have any connection with those people.
It took Mr. Nixon 4 years to get out of Vietnam after he became president. And what was the result? The last time I looked, it was a unified country and was communist. So why the 4 years and the extra lives?
Well, we don't have time to answer that question today, Sam, because our time is up. Thank you all very much. We'll be back with a few words in a moment.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by Merrill Lynch. For clients around the world, we make a difference. And by GE. From power generation to medical systems, we bring good things to life.
There's a problem with most dishwashers. No matter how hard you try, there's always something that doesn't quite fit in. Unless you have the GE Profile dishwasher with Smart Rack design. Unlike the average dishwasher, you get over 20 different loading options that let you arrange pots, pans, and dishes with the greatest of ease. The GE Profile.
Mom.
A fitting end.
No problem.
To any meal.
I want to tell you about my home far, far away. My mother and father are there, and I miss them.
Communication in all its forms links us one to another. For communications to advance, capital is critical.
Don't forget your homework. Bye.
That's why so many communications companies talk to Merrill Lynch. In the last 3 years, we raised over $50 billion for communications companies around the globe, more than any other financial firm. We connect investors to opportunities and the people of the world to each other. For them, it makes a difference. The difference is Merrill Lynch.
The forecast called for a calm, quiet meeting, but a tempest rages instead. It's often the case in today's international business climate, which is why we've prepared a place high above it all, with worldly comforts that refresh, restore, and renew. United Airlines, the calm before and after the storm. Come fly the airline that's uniting the world. Come fly the friendly skies.
It's hooking the young.
I'm the last person you would think would become a junkie.
Housewives, businessmen. It sent Nirvana's Kurt Cobain over the edge. Heroin, a Turning Point exclusive with Aerosmith's Steve Tyler.
This world is full of pain. It's a quick fix.
Barbara Walters, Turning Point, Wednesday at 10, 9 Central.
Finally, a last word about the incredible career of Richard Nixon. In 1960, President Eisenhower handed him the nomination for president as a quarterback hands off a football. He ran against a young senator named John F. Kennedy. In a television studio here in Washington, they had a so-called debate. Kennedy looked good, Nixon didn't. Bad makeup, they said. They spent the airtime arguing about two tiny dots of land off the coast of China called Quemoy and Matsu, both of them entirely worthless, barely fit for the Chinese to raise a head of cabbage and a few pigs. Nixon lost the debate, lost the election, went back to California, ran for governor, lost that, came back, ran for president twice, won twice, and resigned once. In a retirement, 4 presidents so respected his intelligence, they sought his advice. It is hard to believe all of that really happened. For all of us at ABC News, until next week, thank you.
Tonight on World News Sunday, ABC's Peter Jennings reports from South Africa with the latest on the powerful car bomb that exploded in downtown Johannesburg, and the countdown to the historic multiracial elections. That's tonight on World News Sunday.
This Week with David Brinkley is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
Today, ABC Sports presents regional coverage of the NHL playoffs. The Rangers try to close out the Islanders, or Dallas takes on Brett Hull and the Blues. Then, on a special edition of ABC's Wide World of Sports, Americans Shannon Miller and Dominique Dawes go for the gold, plus the men's all-around at the World Gymnastics Championships. All today here on ABC.
I'm here in this auto graveyard to demonstrate New Finish, the once-a-year car polish. Simply wipe it on and wipe it off. There's no rubbing, no buffing. Look how New Finish restored a deep, hard shine to even this weather-beaten old car. You see, New Finish is not a wax. It's a space-age polymer formula that shines better and lasts longer.
And here's proof. An independent laboratory tested New Finish against several leading brands of car polish. After simulating a full year of varying weather, New Finish had the highest gloss and actually retained 90% of its original shine.
Next, we polished this car with new finish and ran it through 52 car washes. After all the harsh detergents and scrubbing, the water still beads. You'll find new finish is great for fiberglass boats, too. So get new finish, the once-a-year car polish. And between polishings, use new finish car wash to clean your car.
New Finish rated #1. Buy New Finish and get a trial size of new vinyl free at participating stores while supplies last. Richard Gere is earning his wings the hard way. Sunday night at 10:30 on 13.
The following is a special presentation of ABC Sports.
The chant of 1940 is not being heard on the island anymore. Maybe they're not ready to call him that on the island, but they are in Manhattan. They are playing his style of hockey. In 180 minutes of Mark Messier and New York Ranger action, the Islanders have been totally torn apart. A primary reason, Mike Richter in net. 1 goal allowed in 3 games. 71 saves on 72 shots. Offensively for the Rangers, no team in the playoffs this season has scored more goals than they have. What all this means for the New York Rangers is this: to another Stanley Cup. Take to the ice at home, and they are trying to avoid what has never happened to a team here before.
Standard as time goes by.
Preaching to the gangs of Southwest Houston later today on Eyewitness News.
From ABC News. This week with David Brinkley. Now from Washington, David Brinkley.
Richard Nixon. His friends rally around him in death as they did in life. His enemies hesitate to say too much, but they do admit now that after he was forced out of the presidency, he spent the next 20 years being helpful and useful to the presidents who came after him. He did have his ups and downs. His ups were high, and his downs were the lowest. The country survived the shock of his resignation and went on. We'll hear today from some who knew him. And on a turbulent weekend, the Serbs in Bosnia were given a deadline: stop the butchery or face more and bigger attacks by NATO's air power. We'll try to deal with all of that with today's guests. Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democrat, New York, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's Secretary. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for coming in today.
Good morning,
Pleased
David.
to have you with us.
Thank you.
George Will is here with us, and Sam Donaldson. Now, I believe you've had a briefing rather recently. Bring us up to date, if you will, on what's happening in Bosnia.
David, the ultimatum put into effect by NATO seems to be working. We're monitoring the situation very carefully, of course, but as the present time, it appears to be working. I've talked several times this morning with General Shalikashvili, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've had reports from Bosnia as well. These are the elements right now. First, there's been no shelling in the city today, although there has been some small arms fire. Second, there are about 140 United Nations troops in the city now. Those are Ukrainians and Northern Europeans. There are about 500 more on their way. These are United Kingdom troops, Egyptians and Russians, and our estimate is they'll arrive about 2 o'clock today. There are evacuations going forward now. British and French helicopters are evacuating wounded. They hope to have out between 200 and 300 during the course of the day.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life. And by ADM, supermarket to the world.
In 1862, the average American farmer fed 5 people for 1 year. Today, he feeds more than 90, not just Americans, but people around the world as well. Obviously, as a leading processor of food ingredients, we at the Archer Daniels Midland Company couldn't survive without the American farmer. But then, neither could you.
To experience the true joy of cooking, it must be pursued with reckless abandon and total disregard for the inevitable splatters, spills, squirts, and the occasional splash. Fortunately, GE's profile cooking appliances have ingenious quick clean features like lift-top ranges, self-cleaning ovens, easy wipe surfaces, and sealed burners. So they clean with just a wipe. GE's profile appliances are so easy to clean, they take the joy of cooking to new heights.
Gorazda, it's taking 200 UN peacekeepers to help maintain a ceasefire. The UN says the Serbs have stopped shelling the town, although there are reports of machine gun and sniper fire in the center. The Serbs are so far not withdrawing their forces, which is in defiance of the NATO ultimatum. Even so, the UN has ruled out the possibility of airstrikes because UN troops who arrived in the town last night would be at risk. Meanwhile, doctors were standing by in Sarajevo to receive wounded from the town, but UN helicopters were held up for nearly 2 hours by the Serbs.
It seems as if the UN is doing everything it can to avoid calling airstrikes, even though the Serbs continue to defy the NATO ultimatum. David.
Tony, exactly what is Gorazda? Is it a big city, a country town, or what? What is it?
It's a small industrial town. Before the war, it had a population in that area of about 38,000. But its importance to the Serbs is it's one of the obstacles on the way to giving them access to the sea. And that, people here say, is their ultimate goal.
Tony, what do you think is going to happen there?
I think the Serbs have realized that NATO and the Western Alliance is very serious in its intentions with Gorazda, and they've pulled back, and I think they will pull back, but they've been playing a game of brinkmanship and testing the resolve of NATO and the UN, which has been shown to be wanting at stages.
Tony, thank you very much. Good luck to you. We'll be back with Secretary of State Warren Christopher in a moment. Secretary of State and former Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, who is a key member of the Senate Watergate Committee. 2 background reports, one from Tony Brinkley in Sarajevo and one from our man Jack Smith in Washington. And a discussion here with George Will, Sam Donaldson, and Cokie Roberts, all here on our Sunday program. First, a little news since the Sunday morning papers. In Johannesburg this morning, a very heavy car bomb exploded near the headquarters of the African National Congress. It killed 7 or more and wounded more than 70 others. The country's first multiracial election is only 2 days away. Richard Nixon will be buried Wednesday in California. President Clinton and all living ex-presidents will attend: Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush. President Clinton has declared Wednesday to be a national day of mourning. UN troops are in Gorazda, planning to move out about 600 patients in need of medical care. With UN troops in the city, it seemed unlikely the threat of airstrikes would be carried out. Now, ABC's Tony Brinkley, standing by in Sarajevo, will bring us up to date. Tony?
A UN convoy left Sarajevo today, bound for the Muslim enclave of